I'd like to introduce Philip Fraser, who then in turn is going to introduce Jim Hightower. And some of you may already know, because there's been a bit of a media spin going on in the last week with Jim here. So by now you might have heard a little bit about Philip, as he's been interviewed on Bay FM and local ABC radio. So Philip has lived the first 30 years of his life in Australia, and he's responsible for the launch of some of Australia's iconic publications in the 60s and the 70s. While he was at Monash University, and he wasn't studying journalism or politics, he was studying to be a doctor, he launched Australia's first pop music magazine newspaper called Go Set, which came out every week for 8 years and outsold Time magazine across Australia. So as a struggling uni student, he got it together and created quite an amazing publication. And then in '72, he launched the Australian edition of Rolling Stone magazine and the countercultural broadsheet The Digger. Philip says he ventured off to America in '76 when Malcolm Fraser had deposed the Whitlam government and The Digger was facing too many lawsuits. So for the next 30 years, he lived in New York City, working on a range of publications there and in Washington, D.C., including one with Ralph Nader, who many people might know as the American consumer rights political activist. And around 2000, a friend suggested that Philip should meet this Texan guy called Jim Hightower. He thought they had a bit in common. And Philip will tell you how that worked out and how it came to be that a couple of years ago he moved back to Australia, and he continues to publish The Lowdown, half the time from beautiful Currabell and the other half from San Francisco. So, Philip, take it away.
Well, good evening, everybody. Great to see a real crowd for some real politics. And thank you, Tricia and Rusty, for being terrific neighbors and for all you've done to make this evening happen. So I'm here to introduce you to Kerry O'Brien and Jim Hightower. And I'm guessing you all know Kerry pretty well, better than I do, in fact, because, you know, I was out of the country for a good part of his career. In fact, I caught his act as an interviewer for the first time 2 years ago, I guess, when he was interviewing a bloke named Tony Abbott. And somehow the next day, this guy Abbott was still trying to explain why he said we shouldn't believe things he said. And so right there I knew that Kerry was an outstanding interviewer. He's also a man who believes that we are all capable of working together for the common good, and that we in fact must do that if we're to survive on this planet. And Jim Hightower believes that too. He and I first met on the phone. I was trying to launch a political newsletter in New York that would tell Americans who really runs the country and to a large extent the world. And Hightower was trying to do that too. In my newsletter, I told him, we won't identify politicians by the districts that they are supposed to represent, because John McCain might come from Arizona, but actually he's the senator for the telecommunications industry. And Joe Biden wasn't representing Delaware, he was representing the credit card companies. So he would be called the senator for the credit card companies. That's great, said Hightower, and then he paused. I just wrote a radio commentary demanding that all Congress critters wear their sponsors' logos on their suits like race car drivers do. So I knew we were on the same track. And within 6 months, we were publishing the Hightower Lowdown, and now, 13 years later, it is still growing with over 100,000 paying subscribers in America. And that's, 12 issues a year for 13 years. Hightower is a recovering politician. He was elected twice to the statewide office of Commissioner for Agriculture in the great state of Texas, and being in charge of agriculture in Texas is a pretty big deal. And in that job, he advocated for curbing the power of big agribusiness, for sustainable, local, organic farming, for family farms, small farms, and immigrant laborers. And you can imagine that didn't make the corporate world very happy. In fact, as he put it, it put him in the sights of the corporate sharpshooters. In fact, it especially annoyed a young, well, not young relatively, but up-and-coming politician named George W. Bush and his manager, handler, brain, Karl Rove. So they decided that they had to put a stop to this Hightower guy being such a popular guy on the electorate. They didn't really do him any terrible damage, but they messed with him enough and made enough of a mess of other people's lives that Hightower decided he'd go back to his previous job as a media person and commentator. So in the States, he does a daily radio commentary that's on about 220 stations. He has written 6 books, several of which made the New York Times bestseller list, even though the mainstream media didn't want to review them, or didn't review them. Partly perhaps because they had, names that didn't sound too much like the New York Times, such as "There's nothing in the middle of the road but yellow stripes and dead armadillos." Or, "If the gods had meant us to vote, they would have given us candidates." Or his most recent one, which was "Swim against the current, even a dead fish will go with the flow." So that's the kind of guy he is. He makes sense of the American political scene in a way that makes sense to me, and I think to a lot of Aussies. It's a kind of, fundamentally it's about the money. The money rules, corporations rule, but I'll let him and Kerry explain all of this. So here they are, ladies and gentlemen, Kerry O'Brien, Jim Hightower.
Thank you. I must say, I enjoyed listening to Philip backstage, particularly when he was explaining that he went to America to explain to the Americans what was wrong with their country. You rather love the image, I must say. Usually it's the other way around, except often they don't actually come here. Now, I should stress at the outset that I'm here as a local. I'm not here... I'm sure the ABC would appreciate me saying that I'm not here on behalf of the ABC, and if anything escapes my lips that sounds like an opinion, it's mine. Now, one of the advantages of reaching a venerable age, which I would suggest I'm just approaching, is that the longer you live, I think, if you've got any brains at all, the greater the perspective you develop about life and the greater appreciation you have about history. And so I thought in that context that the smartest way to start this tonight is to ask Jim to paint a bit of a picture about the kind of America you grew up in, because it was pretty much, I think you were born virtually at the start of the Second World War, so you grew up immediately post-war, and I guess your formative years would have taken you through into the 60s. So what was the America, the things that struck you most about your country in those years?
Well, it was a big country, but very local. I grew up in a small town, mostly Main Street merchants and dirt farmers around the area, and not people who had any pretension about themselves, but a great sense of humor, and a sense that America was a good place, and because it gave a damn about the common good, the notion that we're all in this together. My own father, small business guy, grew up on a tenant farm. My mother did as well. And both of them escaped those farms and got off to start a small business in this little town of Denison, Texas. But they created a middle-class possibility for my two brothers and myself. But they never felt that they did that by themselves. This wasn't, a braggadocio, Koch brothers, I'm in charge, I made this happen, and nobody should get in my way to do what I want to do. They knew that there's a whole support structure out there for the common good. And my father did not know he had a political philosophy. He would have been very embarrassed to have been told that he did. He was not an intellectual, he didn't go to college. But his notion was that we're all in this together. And somebody made me possible, and I could make other people possible. And his philosophy was expressed to me periodically in these terms. He said, Jim, everybody does better when everybody does better. And that's what passes for political philosophy in Denison, Texas.
But did you have a sense that that was pervasive through the whole country? Because you were in a little tiny portion of.
But America is little tiny portions. It's like neighborhoods, We're
a lot of big cities.
Yeah. Well, neighborhoods in big cities. Chicago is not a city; it's a city of neighborhoods. Same with Minneapolis. I'm a lucky duck. I get to travel a lot, so I've been just about every place that's got a zip code in America, and every one of those there's this great sense of spirit and attitude, and the powers that be can't run roughshod over us because we are the powers that be. That was what I grew up in.
That was then.
That was then.
So tell me about now.
Well, now the powers that be have decided that. They're the top dogs, and we're just a bunch of fire hydrants. that they are what matters, and that they can pursue their own good fortunes and not worry about the well-being of the many. Well, that's some kind of a country, but that's not the America that most Americans think that they're a part of and thought that they were a part of. And that's the great disunity that is happening right now. The rise of the plutocracy, an old word, but has new meaning, has new reality in our country as they assert themselves, knocking down the middle class. 90-something% of all the economic growth has been generated in the last 20 years or so, all went to the top, really 1%, and actually 1/10 got the bulk of that. So hence the Occupy movement that says 99% versus the 1%. And it's not that the Occupy movement was the important expression of that, but that the vast majority of the American people agreed with that. They said, yes, that is what has happened. And so there's been a depression among the American people. This is not what we thought it was. This is not the America that we thought we were a part of. And so they're looking, but where they're not getting it from either political party. I'm a Democrat, as Kerry indicated. I was elected, much to the amusement of the people in Texas, for a couple of terms to high political office. But I was elected as a Democrat and proud to be a Democrat from the great tradition of that party, going back to Thomas Jefferson, but right on through Roosevelt and Kennedy and Truman and Johnson, et cetera. But now I realize that some people say we need a third party in America. I wish we had a second party.
So, the America that you see, how did it come to this from where you were growing up?
Money, and relatively recently.
See, this is what I'm curious about, because you paint this fairly quaint picture of a community where consideration and concern for your neighbour counts. But America's also had quite a bloody history, and it's not like capitalism just threw up corporations in the last 20 years. I mean, there were the robber barons in the late 1800s through into the 19th century and before. I mean, there were the carpetbaggers, right, you know, racism, the divide between blacks and whites, a lot of bloody history in America and a lot of greed, as there has been in many other countries. It's human nature.
Right. Well, I don't know if it's human nature or not, but it's grotesque is what it is. You know, I went all the way through high school in segregated schools in this idyllic little town of Denison, Texas. It was ideal for me. It was not ideal for African Americans living right across town. And then, so I graduated in high school in '61, and then went to college 70 miles down the road, University of North Texas, and sat next to, it had integrated, this school had integrated in '54. So I sat next to black kids from my hometown whom I'd never met. You know, this was not a rude awakening for me because I'd already had become aware of the great lie that we were being told. So became a part. But the good news out of all this horror is that progress happens. You know, people lift themselves up. And I don't mean black people, I mean folks get together and realize there's been some great injustice here or some stupidity, and hence the civil rights movement. So we worked to integrate the theaters. Believe it or not, you couldn't sit in the same theater with a black person, go to the drugstore and et cetera. And then, so that then merged into the Vietnam War period. And so the great, you know, the great thing about the American people is that they're revolting in the best sense of that word.
Well, you actually had a revolution.
Yes, indeed. But we had something more than a revolution. We had that notion, back going to my father's thing, of the common good. And you had it here. But I noticed on your coins, Philip gave me a coin today, an older coin, that talked about the Commonwealth of Australia, and you took that off of your coins, took that off of your state. That's a positive thing, to have a Commonwealth. That means we're all in this together.
Except this was a much bigger Commonwealth.
You know, well, and you have...
Which
I
had
guess
colonial overtones.
Back to your question. You actually asked me a question, and I didn't answer.
Well, at least you acknowledged that.
Yeah.
That's novel for me. You've forgotten it too.
I have. Yeah. I've forgotten where I am. But that we had this. We had this possibility of unity. Something big is possible within Australia, within America, and possibly across the oceans and beyond all of that. But we have to really assert that constantly, because the powers that be are constantly trying to shrink that into nothing, into them. And that is what's happening in America right now. So I guess my basic message, I'm sure you're wondering what it is that we've gone a long way down the road from the common good to the narcissistic greed of the few that now dominates our politics and our government, and we can get into that. Yeah. And you're a few steps back from that. But I think you're headed down the same road, and I would warn you to take charge of it immediately.
Well, we'll come back to that too. You talk about corruption of the political process as if it's a relatively recent phenomenon.
No.
But it has been evolving, hasn't it, since the Constitution was written? And I mean, the institutionalised corruption of, as I said before, the robber barons and what they represented, and on the Democratic side and in the organised parties, the boss tweeds and the kind of institutionalised corruption of political parties, going back 120 years.
Well, go back to the founding. The first presidential election in America that elected the first George W. Only 4% of the people were eligible to vote.
Yeah.
couldn't vote if you were a woman, you couldn't vote if you were Native American, couldn't vote if you were African American, couldn't vote if you did not own land.
Yeah. Well, that's how we started here too.
Yeah,
certainly on the latter part.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think we came from the same source. And so it has been the intervening agitators. You know, they try to make that a pejorative, right? You're an agitator. Our workers were perfectly happy in this factory until those union agitators came in. And the poor people didn't mind living up against that toxic waste dump until those environmental agitators came in. Well, hogwash and horse hockey, agitation is what made our country. If it were not for agitators, we'd be wearing white powdered wigs singing God Hail the Queen still today. You know? But it was not the founders who did that. It was the ordinary people, the Thomas Paines and Daniel Shays, the Sojourner Truths and Frederick Douglass, the populists and the Wobblies and the labor movement and the civil rights movement on down to Martin Luther King and Cesar Chavez and the women's movement and et cetera. And so when they say that you're an agitator, just remember that's the center post in the washing machine that gets the dirt out. We need a lot more of that.
But can you put your finger on it? Any one clear thing which changed America for you from that period growing up to now in terms of, I mean, you're hot and strong on the big corporates.
Yeah.
But what was it, if it's true, that has given corporates the power today that you paint compared to 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago?
Yeah.
What's different?
Two things. The first of which is the failure of my party, the Democratic Party, to stand for their core principles, their reason even for existing, which is to represent the working folks, the dirt farmers, the people who care about the air and the water, the consumers, you know, et cetera. Because they started taking the same corporate money that the Republicans did. And again, going back to my own experience, elected in the state of Texas, and in '83 took office, '91 left office. And in that period, my party decided, wait a minute, we have to fight on the television sets. And therefore, that means we've got to get money. And we don't have money, so therefore, we have to get corporate money. And there are corporations who will give us money too, just like they give to the Republicans. And that was true. They were very happy to give us money.
But again, was that, I mean, I can understand television has made a huge difference in terms of how political parties campaign. But big money was backing both parties before that, surely.
No, but not big money like this.
Right.
This is big money on steroids. This is, I mean, unbelievably big money. And my point is that when you start taking those corporate checks, written on the back is the corporate agenda. So suddenly, our party stopped talking about health care for all, not just jobs. I mean, as Jesse Jackson points out, slaves had jobs. You know, that's not the issue. The issue, you could go to Austin, Texas, where I live, and say to any waitress there, for example, that Rick Perry claims that he's created 1 million jobs in the last 10 years.
Now, Rick Perry is the governor of Texas now.
And tried to run for president. He was the oops guy. So said, well, Rick Perry's created 1 million jobs. And she'd say, yeah, I know, I have 3 of them. You know what I mean? So our party quit talking about those things. And therefore, those people quit voting for us, but they didn't necessarily go Republican, they just quit voting. So Rick Perry, he was reelected as governor
And Rick Perry started as a Democrat.
Yes.
And went across to the Republican.
He did indeed, thanks to Karl Rove. So in 2010, he was reelected as governor of the state of Texas, and that was his basis for running for president of the United States. Look at this, I got 58% of the vote, the people love me there, I can cross all these lines. But what he didn't say was that we had the lowest voter turnout in the country. We had 32% of the people vote. So that means he was the actual choice of about 18% of the people of Texas. But the sad thing is Democrats couldn't get 19% because they were not talking about the kind of issues that people care about. So it's not that people went right-wing or went Republican. In terms of understanding America,
They just dropped out.
they just quit voting. And by the way, it's not just Australia doesn't understand America. Americans don't understand America. They don't know that fact. And so I travel America trying to lecture them on that.
Well, I'll take the opportunity to ask you now about the voting system, because Australia is one of the tiny few countries in the world that actually has compulsory voting, and it also has preferential voting.
Yeah, right.
How would you like to have compulsory voting?
I'd like to have preferential voting for sure, and maybe compulsory. I don't know. I don't know how that would sit with Americans yet. So I would have to contemplate that a little bit. And Americans, I would
think about it
propose
yourself. Where a small percentage of people still won't vote, although they might get a fine or they might not. It doesn't matter. But around 90% will turn out to vote.
Yeah.
And maybe 5 or 10% of them might even vote informally, but you'll still end up with 80% of people casting a vote.
So I like it, but it's quite the opposite of what we do, because when I grew up, my first ballot that I cast in '64, you had to pay a poll tax. You had to pay to vote.
That's democratic.
And by the way, it was not a small thing. It would amount to $25 today. And guess who they were trying to dissuade from voting?
We would probably fine you $25 for not voting.
Yeah, there you go. I like your system better.
But that makes a huge difference. I mean, you've actually got to work hard just to get people to come out and vote.
Oh no, it's enormous, and then
part of Obama's problem this time is going to be, isn't it, whether the same number of people turn out this time.
Well, and then we have the electronic voting machines, and the issue of whether they actually count the votes and how they count the votes and how they manipulate them, and then we have the direct oppression of voters at the polling place. Republicans literally, Republicans basically have people at the polling place. Anybody who looks tall, dark-skinned is challenged. I mean, are you legal? I mean, they come right up and say to you, are you legal? I mean, there's not a lot of people crossing the Mexican border into America so they could vote.
But they might want their kids to vote.
Yeah. Well, and they could.
One issue that we do really have in common, and as you made the point, television is the common factor, that with television, politicians campaign differently, everything's more expensive, because each side is more concerned that they've got to get at least as much television time as the other, if not more, and that's where the funding issue comes from. How do you stop it? Because reportedly at this current presidential campaign in the States, they're going to spend something like $2 billion.
Yes.
Now that's madness.
Yeah.
Absolute madness. How do you stop it? And
well,
we are heading down that road.
Well, you stop it by stopping it. This is the people's right to say that what's happened, the people's right to say a corporation is not a person. If it was, Texas would have executed one already. So start with that. But that is the claim of our Supreme Court. But not the Supreme Court, but 5 thugs, black-robed thugs on the Supreme Court, corporatists, put there over the years deliberately by this effort, AstroTurf effort by plutocratic interests, particularly the Koch brothers and a number of other interests right along their lines, to reduce our democracy to a plutocracy based on their ability to put money into our campaigns. And the Supreme Court 2 years ago, 2010, did authorize through a decision in a case called Citizen United to say that corporations are persons with full rights to First Amendment rights to express themselves, and that they may express themselves through money, that money is speech. Those are two defilements of the Constitution, two defilements of common sense and of nature itself, actually.
And what's it meant?
And I'm thinking of nature itself. Maybe we have an action there that the evangelicals could get behind, that this is some sort of perversion going on. The result is that, that now we have two new monstrous entities that have arisen within our politics. One are super PACs, which are entities that may accept unlimited sums of money from wealthy interests and corporate interests. Also unions, but unions don't have money. So it essentially is a corporate power play.
Relatively, you mean? Relatively, don't have money.
Yeah, very relatively, though. I mean, 1,000 to 1 is the balance of what they have.
I'm not sure it's quite that in Australia, but go on.
All right. Well, it's going to be. That's my message. You know? And that's why you should pay attention. Because it is that in America. You know, don't get lost in the little details. They're coming for you.
You'd be surprised. I thought the devil was in the detail.
Yeah. So Philip and I have just finished this very morning the next issue of the Hightower Lowdown on the 5 major Republican candidates for president this year, which include, you know, a couple of psychopaths and at least 2 nutballs, and you know.
And this is your objective. This is your considered objective.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Okay. So this is why Mitt Romney is going to be nominated. That's who his opponents were. Anyway, but the money that was put up in their campaigns were the least of it. Candidates used to raise money to run for office. No longer. We now have these super PACs that are supposedly independent of the candidates, even though the candidates actually form the super PACs and put their staff and brother-in-law in charge of the super PACs. Right. The super PACs raised the enormous amounts of money, and they raised $94 million for these 5 leading candidates for the Republican nomination. 7 men put $40 million of that up. 7 individuals. And they are individuals with very precise interests in what the government can do for them. And they changed the debate of the Republican Party. They made the debate about, yes, you can have differences over how much you're going to bash gays, how extreme you're going to be on religion in government, et cetera. You can have all that stuff. They don't care about that. But all 5 candidates were totally in agreement that we must protect the tax breaks of the super wealthy and the corporate interests. Yes, he was, actually.
We'll come to that in question time.
Yeah, right.
You'll get your chance.
Actually, and I like Ron Paul, but not.
We'll come to it.
You're going to look. You need to look at Ron Paul pretty carefully at what he actually advocates and how he's supporting the same plutocracy. So there was total agreement on the Republican side, and that now shapes the national debate between Obama and the Republicans of what we will talk about. We will not talk about good wages. We'll not talk about health care for everyone. Well, you know, those will be fringe issues. It's because Obama caved in on all the Wall Street bailout issues and the right of the hedge fund operators to get a tax rate lower than, you know, their secretaries and et cetera. So that the debate is changed by this money, this relatively little dab of money, and we're talking $40 million, but completely, these 7 individuals are able to frame a political debate for a nation as big, as sprawling, as diverse and dispersed and as important as America.
Now, because you've referred to the Koch brothers a few times, and it becomes increasingly relevant as we go on, and also to astroturfing, so we need to give that context, I guess.
Right.
The Koch brothers are actually K-O-C-H, aren't they?
Yes.
But pronounced Coke.
Yes.
And they're two billionaires, multi-billionaires.
$21 billion apiece.
So tell me first about astroturfing.
Well, this is, as I say, of these Republican plutocrats, they're as confused as goats on AstroTurf, trying to figure out what the thing is that they should be doing. But AstroTurf is a false grassroots campaign that is financed by the very interests that the campaign should be against. An example is the Tea Party. The Tea Party erupted in America right around November, December 2008. Yeah.
So around the time of the
election.
As the financial crisis was hitting.
As the financial crisis hit. And it was a rebellion against the Wall Street bailout. People were just appalled. I mean, just mad as hell. And so they surged into the streets. But our side, the Democrats and progressives, we were so busy getting Obama inaugurated and wondering who was going to be secretary of this or that, that we didn't pay any attention to those people. And the right wing, particularly a guy named Dick Armey, who had been a member of Congress from Texas, big surprise, and was a lobbyist, a corporate lobbyist, and was also head of an organization called Freedom Works, funded by the Koch brothers. Saw all these people out there wearing little tea bags from their hats and thought, wow, this is good. These people are angry. We could do something with this. And so rushed out there, and with Koch brother money, with political operatives from the Republican Party, took that movement and moved it into a defense of Wall Street. And then
but the astroturfing side of it was substantially conducted on the internet, wasn't it?
Yes.
And little group meetings, but the internet campaign. I mean, the whole thing about astroturfing is falsehood.
Yeah.
Purporting to be something you're not.
Yeah.
And there are actually software programs you can buy now that allow you to send out multiple emails, apparently under different names, but from one location. From one computer, you could send out hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of emails that appear to come from many different people.
Yeah.
That's one version of astroturfing, right?
Yeah,
and this is part of what you're saying was used.
Totally. And so this Freedom Works and Dick Armey claimed to be the Tea Party, claimed to be the grassroots movement. And in fact, the Tea Party manifesto was written by Dick Armey, a corporate lobbyist, sitting in his office on K Street in Washington, D.C. And so they then elected these bunch of members of Congress that totally turned the Republican Party into just rank nutballism. I mean, they just embraced the whole thing. And David Koch was when those people were sworn into office. Their families were there, their children. Photographs were being taken. It was all very lovely. And there was David Koch having a function for them, to welcome them in, and then to educate them, to teach them this is what our program is, this is what we're going to do. And so they have pushed a further deregulation of Wall Street beyond what it already was. And so we now have Citigroup, Goldman Sachs, and et cetera, bigger than they ever were before, with more inability to fail, that whole approach that we will bail you out no matter what. And yet, and the same crooks, the banksters who stole the people's economy, who created this tinkle-down economics that we now have in our country, they're back to getting multi-million-dollar bonuses each year.
But Barack Obama is a part of the program.
He is indeed, and that's the failure. Back up one moment, I'll tell you a little story. Because Goldman Sachs...
Jim, I'm going to ask you to take your hat off. It might be sacrilege to a Texan, but what's happening because of the lighting, I think people are not seeing enough of your face.
Okay. Oh, I think so. All right.
He does have hair.
Yeah. The Goldman Sachs and all these guys, they said, okay, we're back, getting the big bonuses, and we're back making multi-billion-dollar profits and et cetera. on Wall Street, while the victims of the banksterism are still getting pink slips and eviction notices. But they said, wait a minute, we are, don't you understand, we're philanthropists. That this is where charity comes from, because we're able to be rich, then we can give charitable contributions. And Goldman Sachs set aside in 2010, set aside $20 billion to pay its top banksters bonuses. But they said, yeah, but we set $1 billion aside for charity. Well, I'll tell you a great story about charity and how the gods feel about that. This comes from Earl Long. He was governor of Louisiana many moons
Huey
ago.
Long.
Earl Long. That's
Earl Long, his son.
Huey's brother.
Oh,
yeah.
yeah, okay.
They had a little
Because
dynasty.
the son popped up there as a senator.
Yes,
didn't he?
right,
Yeah.
right. Russell.
Kept it in the family.
Yeah. So Earl Long told this story about a rich man who died and tried to go into heaven. But if you go into that little Methodist church that I did in Denison, Texas, you'd know that you just don't go into heaven. You appear at the pearly gates. And there's an angel outside, reviews your life, and then St. Peter behind the gate decides whether you get to come in or not. And so here comes this rich man. And the angel looks over his life and says, my God, you never did no good for nobody, no way. What are you doing here? And the rich man said, well, no, that's not entirely true. He said, 1924, there was a blind beggar man on the street, and I put a nickel in his cup. Angel said, so? The rich man said, well, 1934, there was a widow woman on the street. She needed car fare home. I gave her a nickel. Angel said, that doesn't make up for a life of greed. And the rich man said, well, now, wait a minute. Said, I have a consistent pattern of philanthropy. In 1944, I was coming out of my bank at Salvation Army kettle there at Christmas time. I put a nickel in there. And so the angel turns back to St. Peter and says, what in the world are we going to do with this man? And St. Peter said, give him back his 15 cents and tell him to go to hell. Because it's not charity that people want. We want economic fairness, social justice, equal opportunity for all people. That's what America's founded on. Economic fairness, social justice, equal opportunity for all people. Those are the values. If you look at the preamble to the U.S. Constitution, that's what it says.
Well, I think it's universally hailed as a great constitution, and people from the outside looking in could be forgiven for wondering what happened between the writing of the Constitution
and that's
in
what
2012.
I'm saying. And that's what I'm saying. This is what has happened, is the version of those ideals by people who don't believe in those values and find them of little use, and therefore we can dispense with them. But what I'm saying to you is that those values are still very much in the heart and in the guts of the American people, rarely appealed to, including by my party. But if you did do that, there would be a tremendous response. And that's why Occupy happened. I mean, out of nowhere, these kids in tents and in a park in New York sparked this phenomenal reaction among the American people, saying, yeah, it's the inequality, it's the inequity, it's the greed, that's what we're talking about. And now that movement is criticized, well, you don't have a program. Well, the American Revolution didn't have a program for years. It took them 2 or 3 decades before they had a program, much less a constitution, much less an agreement that we would actually form a national government.
But it's not just America that's on a certain path now, is
Yes.
it? It's global. I mean,
Absolutely.
this is it's a global economy now. It's not just a series of national economies. Everything seems global. The world is smaller. Borders seem less relevant. National sovereignty is harder to define. Banks move money around in the blink of an eye, massively. There's a sense, isn't there, that things are kind of out of control of just about any individual.
Yes, exactly. And that's the rebellion. Because people are looking for a way to control it. And you can control it locally. And sometimes in states.
But can you really?
Yes. I'll give you an example. The food economy, which I've spent a good bit of my time in, both as a consumer and policy person. We had a rebellion in our country. I called it in my Swim Against the Current book the Upchuck rebellion because people were disgusted by the industrialized food that they were getting. Susan DeMarco and I wrote a book in '72 called Hard Tomatoes, Hard Times. And it was, where did those hard tomatoes come from? They were in the little cellophane packages, little pink tomatoes back then. Well, they came from the fact that Del Monte Corporation in California wanted to do away with farm workers, so they wanted a mechanical harvester of tomatoes. And so they got the government program, the University of California at Davis, the land-grant college, to build them a mechanical harvester that would put all these workers out of jobs. But unfortunately, the harvester crushed the tomatoes. So then they, of course, went to University of California at Davis and University of Florida to say, build us a tomato that will not be crushed. And so that's where that tomato came from. And Susan DeMarco sat in front of the head of agriculture research when we were doing this little, and she at the time was a young, very attractive young woman, across the table and being very naive appearing and saying, well, yes, sir, what, you know, the tomatoes that you've made, because he was very proud of these tomatoes. But yes, sir, she said, but I grew up in New Jersey and we had these very ripe, very juicy, good, flavorful tomatoes, and these don't seem to have the same taste. And he leaned over the table at her and said, your children will never know the difference. But of course the children did. And those children are the ones who then rebelled and helped with farmers who didn't want to do the pesticides to create an organic, sustainable, local agriculture marketed through farmers markets, marketed through chefs and then food artisans and created a whole new food economy. This is the biggest and fastest growing segment of the food economy in the United States. That didn't come from any corporation, didn't come from any government. It came from just ordinary people saying, we want to do something different and get together and doing it.
So briefly tell me about your that period when you were the Commissioner for Agriculture in Texas. Yeah. What would you say were the hallmarks, and this was an elected position, what were the hallmarks of your time there?
I had run a very populist campaign, getting farmers together with people whom they were told were their enemies, labor, environmentalists, consumers. In fact, a lobbyist for the Farm Bureau, a very smarmy guy, came up to me, and that's where the title of one of my books came from, came up to me after I was elected and said, all right, well, you got in, but and if you'll just move over to the middle of the road, you know, we can get along. You know, he had a very hot breath, you know. So
got the picture.
And I told a farmer friend of mine, he was out of the Panhandle, I told him, I said, about this guy. You know, he said, oh, hell, Hightower. I said, there's nothing in the middle of the road but yellow stripes and dead armadillos. So just get over here with the people who support you, and we'll do something. And so that's what I said to my staff. And we had about, this is an agency of about 600 people, staff. We had 16 different district offices. We had a state airplane, that was big, and an authority that had not been exercised. So I got my staff together and said something that Franklin Roosevelt said in 1933 when he took office, and he got his people together and he said, do something. If it works, do it again. If it doesn't work, do something else. Right. And that's about the wisdom that I was able to offer to them. But we brought people in who could organize folks. But one thing that we did was I'd been supported by the farm workers, Cesar Chavez's organizations, and we knew that farmers had just a rampaging rate of cancer because of the pesticides in the water, of all the applications that they were putting on their own land. They were doing it themselves, and that they were very upset about that and worried. And so anyway, so we were able to get to promulgate pesticide regulations, the most comprehensive in the country at that time. And that was not appreciated by the chemical industry. Texas had we were the biggest pesticide producer and the largest user of pesticides, and they didn't want any of that to be changed, but we did change it, and so they were really PO'd about that. So they recruited Karl Rove. Well, first of all, they introduced two pieces of legislation. One to take the pesticide authority out of the ag department, and 2, to make the ag department, the ag commissioner appointed rather than elected. Not too subtle. So they had a hearing, and Rick Perry was the Democrat at the time, chair of this subcommittee that was holding this hearing. It was in a room.
This is the state legislature.
Yeah, state legislature, in a room smaller than the green room upstairs here. But they had to move it to the biggest room in the Capitol, the House chamber, because hundreds of people had shown up for this hearing. In part because Willie Nelson was my leadoff witness. Barbara Jordan, the great constitutional voice, sounded like the Constitution, was my second witness. And my third witness was the chairwoman of the Dallas Women's Republican Organization. Because even Republicans don't like their babies eating pesticides, it turns out. So at the end of this hearing, at which Willie Nelson allowed us how well that he had said he'd been up to Abbott, his old hometown, and he was talking to his cousin Cecil. And he said to Cecil, there's no jackrabbits around here anymore. And Cecil said, no, the pesticides got them. And Willie said he was telling that story later down at Lukenbach, Texas, to a friend, and the guy said, well, there's no horny toads anymore either. And Willie said, yeah, that's right, there's no horny toads. What happened to the horny toads? He said, well, they killed all the ants, and that's what the horny toads ate. And so the pesticides got them. And Willie said, so I'm here for the horny toads and the jackrabbits. And after that, no member of the committee would even speak, much less make the motion to try.
So the whole thing collapsed.
Yeah, the whole thing collapsed right there. But then, of course, they came after me in the election. But
just tell me quickly what you did with farmers markets.
well, I grew up, my Uncle Ben Fletcher in Weatherford, Texas, kept trying to make a success of something, and he was mostly a success at having a good time in life. He wore overalls and loose shoes and just felt good about life, But he tried raising chickens, and that didn't work out, and he raised watermelons, but he could take those melons down to a little farmer's market in Weatherford, Texas, big old oak barrels with big chunks of ice, icing down these old black diamond watermelons. They were just delicious as could be. And I was a kid and I was there, and I thought, wow, what a wonderful place. Life and spirit and smells and food and people enjoying themselves. And that's not what I thought at the time, but that's what I remembered looking back. And I lived in Washington, D.C. for 10 years up on Capitol Hill, and right there, 3 blocks from my home was Eastern Market, and a farmer's market that existed year-round. With artisans, cheese, and et cetera, poultry, and I thought, wow, this is great. And then I went back, first I went back, I was the editor of the Texas Observer, and then, Kerry, I made the only downward career move you can make from journalism, which is to go into politics.
Silly close run race, Jim.
Yeah. And ran for this office, this Ag Commission office, and on a program of farmers markets. And the Dallas Morning News, very conservative right-wing paper, or Rupert Murdoch-style paper. I've always thought better of Australia that Rupert Murdoch deserted it. I thought, that says a lot right there.
In fact, he chose Texas for his first American
There
paper.
you go, right? Yeah, right. And anyway, so the Dallas News said, well, if people wanted farmers markets, the free market would have created them. But we tried it anyway and brought in this guy out of Tennessee who ended up being gay. I had no idea, and I sent him up to my home county in Denison, Texas, and one of our people came up and said, "You do know he's gay?" And I said,
Now I'm going to throw it over to questions from the audience in a minute, but I do want to put this to you, and it's you describe yourself as a progressive
It was unusual at the time
populist.
to have somebody overtly gay doing marketing for agriculture.
In upcountry Texas.
Yeah, right. So anyway, there he was.
I hope he was extremely flamboyantly.
Yeah, well, he was a bit, but nonetheless, we helped to establish, in a short period of time, more than 100 of these farmers markets because people wanted them. I'll tell you that.
And how much of that has survived?
Oh, no, not survived. They've all survived, but now we have 15, I think, in Austin. now. I mean, it's just huge. And I was at one, I go regularly, to about 3 or 4 of them, if I'm home on a Saturday. And I was there a couple of years ago, and this guy and he came over to say, you know, I want to thank you for, you know, making this possible. You know, he'd figured that out, and I said, well, how's it working out for you? And I took him back a moment, and he thought, and he said, well, I'm still poor, but I'm poor on my own terms. So that's pretty good.
Do you envisage a world where there are no corporates? It's just a world of cooperatives?
No, yeah, that'd be good.
Great. Good in theory.
And I totally agree with you that populism can be a fraud. The phrase populism can be a fraud. But, you know, I've been there. I've done it. I got elected as such and then governed as such and continued to try to articulate as such and support populist movements like these food movements. And you mentioned cooperatives. Leland Stanford, a robber baron in 1860s to the 1890s, I forget his railroad, but literally a railroad robber baron out of California. He's the guy who drove the Golden Spike and the Transcontinental Railroad.
And had the Chinese
exploiting Chinese labor.
Yeah.
But he, later in life, he began to study and to recognize that corporations were completely unnecessary and totally exploitative, and that a cooperative could do anything that a corporation did, but do it democratically. And so he became a strong advocate for it, and he was in the U.S. Senate. That was in a period when you were appointed to the Senate by the legislature. You weren't elected. And he got appointed because of his wealth. And he championed this cooperative principle with numerous pieces of legislation, not one of which ever got out of committee. And he created Stanford University, one of the great universities of the world, he endowed it to be a teacher of cooperative principles and cooperative management and et cetera. 2 years later, he died, and they immediately wiped all that off the books, and there's not even a cooperative course taught at Stanford University today. But he understood what was possible, and the cooperative movement now is just insurgent in our country. And I think a bit here, and in some places it's been there for a long, long time. But I am now a member of the first ever cooperatively owned, worker-managed brew pub in America. We're talking beer, people. Because a brew pub is a pub that makes its own beer and sells it. And this is a cooperative enterprise, and they have your system here, which is very unique in America, and I love it, which is you don't have to tip because we pay people an actual wage, you know, and so they don't have to grovel for this stuff. And this co-op is their economic model is based on this, but there's
not room for both the cooperative and the corporate.
Yeah,
because there are cooperatives that get big and then they convert to corporations.
It's a matter of who controls. I mean, there's you got to have banks, but it doesn't mean you have to have J.P. Morgan Chase and Goldman Sachs and you know, J.P. Morgan Stanley as your
But you've
only
almost got to
banks.
put a limit on size to avoid that, haven't you? I mean,
Yes.
Isn't it? Everything seems to be about growth in business. It's about growth.
Yes.
And
growth.
so you just keep growing, and if you don't grow, you get taken over, and something else which becomes big.
That's the game of Monopoly, right?
Oh.
And you go around the table, and finally somebody owns it all, and you own nothing. So are you going to be a democratic society, or are you going to be a monopolistic society? It's not about corporation. It's about monopoly power. It's about control over people's lives.
But don't you have controls on monopoly in America? You've got antitrust laws.
Yeah, right. It's a joke. I mean, come on. You know? I mean, that causes guffaws in boardrooms. You know, we're going to unleash the antitrust agency against you. Yeah, right.
Okay.
So
Now, the only problem we're going to have in throwing to questions is that it's impossible to see you. We're going to have to lift the lights a bit.
I think they might.
And we've got a couple of roving microphones
Yes.
that are going to come to you.
There we go. Oh.
And we've already got a question down the back there. If we can get the microphone to the gentleman in the second back row, third back row. Just try and keep the questions reasonably brief, if you could.
Yeah, hi Jim and Kerry. My name's Thomas. I lived in the US for quite a long time, so I'm quite familiar with your radio show. When I could get my housemate to get the shock jock off the radio, it was. But I want to ask you a question, and feel free to not answer it, because I know there's a lot of crackpot attached to this subject. But 9/11, I don't hear you talk a lot about it.
The way this question comes up all the time as I travel around the country, to say we ought to have because there is so much public
Conjecture.
Consideration that this is not, that we haven't got to the bottom of this. So I think we need a very independent, totally scientific, I don't know what that means, totally scientific, but as much as scientific as you can have, independent science that you can have to examine this. I'm not smart enough to figure it out. I think it would be a conspiracy of biblical proportions to have been able to pull that off.
This is the theory that the buildings were blown up from within rather than the planes,
right?
And that it was.
I don't particularly believe that, but I also I know that there's enough public dissension about that that it deserves really full explication of what actually happened. I think it'll work out that it was
what we think it was.
Yeah, what we think it was. But
The problem is, it's like put an airline that's 300 feet wide through a 20-foot hole.
Yeah.
And no plane can get it.
Again,
The minute you walk down that road, we're going to spend the next 3 days pouring over the coals of this. But, now, we've got several hands up here. Can we get a microphone to the lady first? And sorry?
Yeah.
We'll get there. We'll get there.
My name is Helena Norberg Hodge, and I've been a fan of yours since the late 70s. And we have many friends in common, so I hope I'll have a chance to talk to you later. I was dying to have you say something about globalization when Kerry was asking about what happened in those 30 years. From our analysis, it was that deregulation at the global level that gave the multinationals and the banks so much power to then blackmail governments. You know, they'll go elsewhere if they don't lower the standards. They'll go elsewhere if they don't give the biggest, fattest global infrastructure to the global corporations. So I wonder whether you agree with that. And then the second question just is, I've been calling what I've been trying to promote, also promoting farmers markets and so on, localization instead of globalization. I wonder what you think about that terminology.
Yes. Well, first of all, I know of your work, and thank you very much. I appreciate what you stand for and what you've been doing. And exactly right, globalization. I was at the WTO conflagration in Seattle in 1999 and had a radio talk show at the time, and so we broadcast live from there for many days in the midst of that. But yeah, this is the WTO is an abomination. They talk about the need. Basically, it is a way for corporations to say that you cannot even have a local buy New South Wales food products, that your government can't even buy those things. They can't have a program to give preference to local producers, which is nonsense. I mean, that's the antithesis of democracy. And while we must all think globally, it doesn't mean that we should be ruled globally. And that's what this represents. And that's why the local movement is so important. The local movement that I have been a part of in my country it is not inward looking. They understand that people everywhere need an opportunity, and that includes their ability to control their own economies. And that's really what local movement is about, that no outside conglomerate or government can come in and say, this is what you have to do, that you have to accept Walmart saying that they have organic food even though it's produced in China and has traveled how many ever thousands of miles to get there, and who knows whether it's organic or not, but that they have a law that says that decrees that. So the local movement is a global movement, and that's the important part of it, I think.
The gentleman behind.
Oh, Jim, I was just wondering, who do you think Obama's going to win the next presidential election? If he does, do you hold any hope at all of him able to conduct a program that we all hoped he would have done? And finally, you take a very pessimistic view of the future of America, and I don't share that really, in the sense that the corporation's power that you've defined so well, you have to hold out some hope, apart from little local movements, that there'll be a chance to defy those corporations, or at least reduce their power, reduce the power of the plutocracy. As I said, you sound very pessimistic.
And Jim, but that's Craig McGregor, who's an Australian writer who actually spent some years living in America writing for the New York Times, amongst others.
Very good. I think Obama will win, in large part because of whom he's up against. And I think he will be slightly more progressive than he has been in this first term, because I think that's how he has to campaign in order to win. He has got to convince...
He has to create a difference? He has to create a difference?
Yeah, well, I think he is. I mean, he is saying there's the corporate powers and the money interests in the Wall Street, and they're opposing everything that I stand for to try to create some jobs, to try to have health care for people, and et cetera. And so it's us against them. And so,
but hasn't he got a real case to answer that the people who were advising him in his response to the global crisis came from Wall Street? They were creatures of Wall Street.
Of course he does. Of course he does. And you know, I mean, he's been confronted with that again and again. I think the gentleman would agree. You know that. I mean, it's the Robert Rubin crowd. You know, when you pick Larry Sumner's and Timmy Geithner to be your economic leaders, when you had Joseph Stiglitz and you had Jamie Galbraith, and you had some real good, solid people who could have been at least in the administration. They didn't have to be the only ones, but they could have been there and be competitive. Then, yeah, I mean, he's the one who decided that we would try to regulate Wall Street. You can't regulate Wall Street. They have battalions of lawyers who are expert at plunging holes into any law, into any regulation. You have to decentralize Wall Street. You have to restructure. And that's populism versus liberalism. Liberalism, you say, well, let's try to regulate the worst of what is happening here. Well, no, you've got to restructure it so that the worst can't happen. Move that money down into community banks, into independent banks, into credit unions, banks that were not in financial institutions, that did not create the crisis, that were making loans to regular people. Why would you reward the people who created the crisis instead of rewarding those who had done the opposite of crisis, who had been beneficial?
Pessimism.
Pessimism, yes. I'm sorry that I come across as pessimistic. I don't mean that at all, because like I say, I've been just about every place that's got a zip code in America, and I find, you know, some people, some group of people, some coalitions of group of peoples who are doing extraordinary things, who are making these changes. Take the huge change, the biggest problem that we face, which is money in politics. The state of Maine for 10 years now has had public financing of their elections. They have 84% of their state senate and 86% of their state house elected without taking a dime in public money. It has totally changed the politics in those places.
Of public money?
Public money, public financing of elections.
What about corporate?
You can't take the corporate money.
Right.
If you don't take the corporate money, you get a competitive amount of public money to conduct your campaigns. And that Janet Napolitano, governor of Arizona, that left-wing state of Arizona, has public financing of its elections. And she was elected. She said she could not even have run for office except for public financing possibility for her. But more importantly, she said that once she was governor, that then when she had went to a legislator's office or had one in to talk about a particular bill, that she could have a conversation with that legislator without the gorilla of big money sitting between them, because it didn't matter. That the legislator had access to public money, she had access to public. They didn't have to fight that fight.
So is the idea catching? That's the question.
Oh yeah, it's catching. North Carolina has it for their Public Utility Commission and their judicial elections. New Mexico has it. Portland, Oregon. It's growing. You can do this. You don't have to wait on the national government. You don't have to wait on your state government. You can do it at any level of government. Albuquerque, New Mexico, Portland, Oregon have done it. Public financing of their local election. It totally changes politics. I'll tell you a quick story. Molly Ivins, a great iconic writer from my state of Texas, a friend of mine years ago. Molly told about a state senator who got elected and came to Austin. Right away, a corporate lobbyist came up to him and said, all right, tomorrow I'm going to need your vote in this committee. And here's $200. And the state senator said, well, all right, it's looking good. But the next day, lo and behold, the state senator votes against the lobbyist's bill. And so the lobbyist comes up to him and says, what the hell, what are you doing? And he said, well, the other side offered me $400. And so the lobbyist explodes all over him, talking about integrity and ethics. And the state senator straightened himself up as good as he could and said, well, you knew I was weak when I took the 200.
Well, at least he didn't come back for 6.
Well, he would have if he had known, you know.
But can you, I mean, I can remember being extremely sceptical. When I heard Barack Obama in the last campaign promising to change the culture of Washington was the point where I thought, come on, you're stretching it. That system is beyond redemption unless you stuck a bomb under Washington and built from the ground up again. Isn't that right? I mean, this is a city of 40,000 lobbyists?
Yes, but the bomb is not in Washington. The bomb's in the countryside. The bomb's in the people, and that's what I say. That's where my optimism comes from, because I go out there and people know what's happening, but they don't know what to do about it. You know? And so what lever are they going to pull? Again, my party is taking the same money as the Republicans are taking, so there's no trust in that. And Obama, I think, is some combination of he's going to create enough trust by opposing the Wall Street interests and the failure of the other side, the complete.
Jim has suggested at one point that all politicians should wear their sponsors' logos in the same way as a sports person does.
As a race car drivers.
What logos would Barack Obama wear?
Well, he would have worn the Wall Street logos, right? Because he had the financing last time of the Wall Street. Now Wall Street's abandoned him. Mitt Romney is their boy because, of course, he is literally one of them. But the people are the bomb, and you can't win an inside fight. If you're seeking a progressive result, you cannot fight it inside, because that's where the money controls. So you have to go outside and pull that in. And that's that story I told earlier about Willie Nelson and my fight against the pesticide interests. I couldn't have won that inside at all. They would have crushed me. But by bringing those forces from the outside in, then we could shame them into not doing anything.
Can we bring the microphone down to the front? You might have to stand up, just so people can see where the voice is coming from.
I'm getting back to Ron Paul again. Now, I've been following him, and I've never followed American politics before, but a friend of mine 6 months ago, or 4 months ago, these friends pointed him out, and I've been listening to what he's been saying. And he's all for giving back the liberty to people. He's not taking corporation money. He believes in bringing back the military from overseas, not aggravating Iran and getting them out of Afghanistan. He makes a lot of sense, you know. I mean,
Yes.
and the media will not follow him. The mainstream media will not cover him. He's still in the running against Mitt Romney.
not really.
He's still, but nobody mentions him.
Yes. No, yes. Well, he's not in the running for president, but he is in the running to have an impact on the Republican Party, and it's a positive impact on the Republican Party overall. But don't get carried away, because yes, he does have corporate money. Peter Thiel, who's the founder of PayPal, is a $2.5 million contributor to Ron Paul's campaign. So he has a super PAC. And it has been funded by some of the same interests. And Thiel is also one of the chief investors in Facebook. So he has a very strong corporate interest in Ron Paul getting elected. So Paul is willing to take that money. So let us not talk about purity in Republican politics. But he is certainly better than many others. I know Ron Paul. He's from Texas. He's a member of Congress from Texas. He has an integrity about libertarianism that the others do not. So there is something there to what you say, but don't just absorb it all like a sponge. I mean, look a little. And I totally agree with you on the wars and et cetera. But also, he wants to do away with Social Security. He wants to do away with Medicare. He wants to do away with all kinds of things that the American people do not want to do away with. So that's not all that positive.
I think we're at the point where we maybe have one more question.
Okay, well, I saw one over here before I saw you, I'm afraid. Yeah.
We might take
Well,
a
look,
couple.
I think we can take a couple.
Yeah, we can take a couple.
We haven't had too much stirring in the audience yet. I think we're still...
Yeah.
Hi. I just wanted to ask you about, you say, you know, we're all in this together, and no doubt, you know, that is the solution to, you know, achieving some of the things that you're talking about. However, America has a strong history of an us versus them, you know, mentality that goes back a long way in terms of, you know, if some of these alternate views are branded un-American, you're labelled instantly in a very sensationalist way. In the past, you're a communist. Now, you know, the brand is now moved towards terrorism. You're branded a terrorist when you try to bring up these alternate views. How do you see America and essentially the world getting? Unfortunately, Australia's going down this path as well. How do we get past that so that these alternate views can get out into the public and we can actually start to make some changes? But I feel that, you know, we've got to move past this idea of, you know, us versus them before we can actually start to get a lot of these ideas out into the public.
Yes, that's very important, and we do have that nativistic history, very ugly, and I've known people personally, I've had a little dab of it myself, but I've known people like John Henry Falk from my state and others who've been really abused by that attitude. But you deal with it by dealing with it. You deal with it by confronting it. Once you know people, and that's what we learned in the Civil Rights Movement. As soon as you sit next to a black person, you know the lie that you've been told. You can figure it out. And the same thing with the Muslim that is taking place in our country now, the push. But it's such a narrow, small percentage of the people who push that idea. It is nowhere near a significant minority, much less a majority, of the American people who believe any of that crap. So you've got to have some faith in people, and then you have to appeal to that faith, and you have to have some politicians of courage. And the good news is there are some of those. You know, I was
health health is such a fundamental in any society,
yeah.
and yet America has never really bitten the bullet with a universal health policy that provides reasonable health security for all.
Right.
Now, you would think on that fundamental issue that if a system wasn't working, that there would be a majority of people who would demand change, but they never have.
Well, the majority of people are demanding change. It is the politicians who are not responding to that demand for change because they're taking money from the insurance companies.
But why isn't the sort of populism you're talking about evident there? Isn't there
Because,
also,
well, it
aren't a
is.
lot of people
well, wait a minute.
scared
Yep.
into...
Yes, yeah, all right. So we haven't gotten there, but the state of Vermont is doing it. The state of Maine, because they have public financing of their elections, so they don't have to answer to the insurance lobbyists, are doing it. Oregon is about to do it. So it is building in the countryside, and we're going to get there. I mean, we got there with Medicare under Harry Truman first, and then Medicare under Medicaid under Lyndon Johnson, and the push continues. I mean, the sad thing, the thing is that that corporation for a while provided health insurance for about 60% of the workers. Now they're not. Now it's down to 40 or even and plummeting. But the sad thing is that those corporations, they know their own self-interest. They know that they're being beat to death in the international market because they have to pay for health insurance, and their competitors don't. But they don't go to the Congress and say, "Save us," and that is the big fight. I was with Bernie Sanders, a great senator from Vermont, socialist, who. From the Bronx. In fact, Pat Leahy's another senator from the other senator from Vermont, and he's from Vermont. Bernie's actually from the Bronx. And a guy went up to Pat Leahy once and said, "Why don't you have a Vermont accent like Bernie Sanders does?" Anyway, that means absolutely nothing. What we're talking about here. It's a great story.
Now, last question. Sorry, it's behind you.
Hi, and thank you. I wanted to go back just briefly to what you were describing in the beginning, Jim, about the idea of the common good. And you painted a very pretty picture of what it was like in those days, and I'd certainly agree with that. Do you see any really good use of the availability of the communications that's available to us, making a difference and bringing those people together to bring some real pressure on the political process? Thank you.
Yes, I do. And that's because even though we can bemoan the Murdochs and the corporate powers that control the media in America, that we actually have a whole lot of media on our side. Philip's my little newsletter, but Rachel Maddow and the whole MSNBC network, Amy Goodman and Tom Hartman on the radio, the independent bookstores that we have, the community radio stations. No piece of that is very big, but if you add it all up, we're reaching millions of people. And talking to ordinary folks as well. My radio commentaries are in Austin, Berkeley, Madison, Greenwich Village, but they're also in Kansas City, Tampa, Albuquerque, just regular towns. And again, going back to the start of our little conversation here, these people are pretty commonsensical, and they know what's going on. And we do not have anymore in America a comfortable middle class. We have a middle class in deep decline, just plummeting decline, a dramatic rise in poverty of people who thought that they were assured of being okay 4 years ago, and now know that they are not. So this is very much up for grabs. And oh, they are awake. I guarantee you, they're awake. But they're looking for what to do.
Because their choices in this next presidential election are between
presidential election or congressional election. Money is controlling both parties. That's what we're saying, and that's what's about to happen to you. It already is beginning to happen to you. And so again, I'm saying to you, pay attention right now, because it will get dramatically worse here. The money control of your mining conglomerates or whatever, it doesn't matter who, but your Wall Street types are going to be asserting the same kind of things they are now. That money must control, that they must have a voice that's bigger than the rest of you, and combined, and all that. So the whole horse hockey will be out there. So I would just, and it's what I say to folks, and I do, you know, I basically make a living running my mouth. So it's what I say in all of my messages. I'll leave you with this. It's from Louis Grizzard, a late great Southern humorist, who knew something that we in the Southern U.S. had known for a long time, and that is that there's a great big difference between being naked and being naked. Being naked means you have no clothes on, but being naked means you have no clothes on and you are up to something. So you got to get up to something.
Jim,
Well, is this on?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you both. I did suggest to Jim the other day that we should make an application to the State Department in the United States for a grant for improving relations between the United States, and understanding of our two cultures. And maybe we've done a bit of that, but you know, our chances of getting a State Department grant are about the same as getting one from the Australian government. We have got a small pile of copies of the Hightower Lowdown. If anybody really wants one, you can come up here and get them. And Amanda, the wonderful person in charge of the food and drink out there at the cafe, wants you to know that they're still serving all of those things, including their own special creation for tonight, a cocktail named the Hightower. On that note, good night, everybody. Thank you to you all. Thank you to all the people who helped make this a good evening.
Thank you.